Hello everyone. Most of you, well, some of you, well, one or two of you should know me by now, but just in case you don't, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and in this video, as per its title, I'm going to be talking about some bladesmithing I've been doing. Now, I've been attempting this sort of thing for years with varying results, but one of my most recent projects, or at least at the time of saying this, was a sort of Celtic style sword, and thought I'd talk about the design, what inspired it, and also a bit of an idea of the process that made it as well, just to sort of maybe give some people ideas and, you know, a bit of an interesting topic to discuss, because people love swords, using swords, and why not also making swords? You know, it all kind of, it goes hand in hand. It all sort of, you know, it's part of the process of swords and swordsmanship. So with this Celtic sword, in terms of its general design and its sort of shape and, you know, the sort of parameters I looked at, I wanted to make the longest blade that I'd ever created thus far. Now, before I made the Celtic sword, the longest blade I made was a sort of equivalent to sort of like a Sparta type of blade, but actually really short and more like the length of a gladius type of thing, which was only a 21-inch blade, which is quite short. So I wanted to try and up it quite a bit to at least 24, maybe I see if I could go up to 27 inches like a proper arming sword, you know, those sorts of lengths. Because the longer the blade, the more you can reach your opponent and the more oomph you've got, because it's that whole thing about leverage. There's only so much of a chop you can do of a knife, even a really big knife, like a Bowie knife or, you know, a Arkansas toothpick type of thing, but really you want that blade to be longer. So of course I wanted to push that. So I've managed to get it up to about 26 inches, which is obviously quite good for my level of skill. And I decided to give it that sort of Celtic shape because I wanted another double-edged blade because they're quite nice. And something of a spine because I don't have the fullerene tools yet. So Celtic swords just seem to be a good idea. And it's got a sort of a flare at the top, which means it's got more forward weight to lend itself to cutting things and chopping through things. And then it sort of has a bit more of a slender blade at the bottom. Now, the overall blade design is inspired by the Limehouse sword, which is a historical example that was found. And it's a type of Celtic sword which, like I said, it has that flaring sort of towards the top, but it also tapers to a fine point. On top of that, it doesn't go quite as extreme in a sort of wasp waist or hourglass figure like we had on the falcata that I tried to make, and actually went quite nicely as a cutter, but was quite a short blade at only 19 inches. This blade, on the other hand, was one that's, because the Limehouse sword actually didn't have that type of thing, it became more slender, but rather than having a sort of a waist, you know, that tight section, it was more like there was the flare and then it went down to a narrower blade, but then it stayed that breadth. And that's quite nice, not only for having a good cutting performance through the whole blade rather than only in that last bit, it's also good for structure as well, because of course in the bits that are thinner, in the bits that are narrower, that's where you get the most flex. And on a normal sword like, say, a medieval sword, you usually have it narrower and thinner at the tip, and then it gradually broadens and thickens with what's called a distal taper in many cases as you go back. This is because it's kind of like bows. If you've ever done archery, what you're supposed to have is, there's a part called the riser, the bit next to your hand, and that does the least flexing, if any at all. Some bows are designed, like if you look at modern takedown bows, they're designed that the part in the hand does not flex at all. But other designs, like, I forgot the name of it, but certain English longbows and things actually are designed to bend to some degree in the whole stave. But it's still always, in the bit next to your hand, is where the least flex happens. And then right towards the very tip is where it tries to flex the most. And when you get something like a bow, it creates that nice C or D shape when it's strung, and then of course exaggerates as you draw and loose the shot. This same principle applies to swords, so you normally have it, like I said, thinner and narrower at the tip, and then it means that if something were, let's say you stabbed against a shield or some armour, or maybe met with bone and it was a hard material, then it will try to flex, of course, and it's good because it means there's the most flex right at the tip, and then there's gradually less flex as it goes down the blade. And it usually means that the blade will bend and then spring back to true form instead of either taking a fold or just snapping in pieces. So it's kind of a worry sometimes when you have blades that are narrower in their bottom half. Of course, you can compensate for that with the thickness, but then you've got that problem where you've got such a thick stock that trying to make an edge out of it, it's really bad, and it's like an axe, and you don't want to do that. So you still kind of have to keep it fairly narrow, fairly thin rather. So it's kind of a bit of a trade-off and a bit of a problem, even though it does mean that the broad part at the front, the top half, is really good for that chopping and slicing for the same weight of the sword and the same strength in the user's arms. So it's a nice compromise that you've still got that effect going on with the chopping and slicing madness, but you don't have to worry quite so much about the bottom half being kind of a weak point that could suddenly snap off. Especially since the material I'm using was recycled steel. It's spring steel from a sort of a leaf spring, which is a kind of a piece of suspension from trucks and pickups and those kinds of things. And I think it did have quite a bit of use because, of course, it was there in a scrapyard when I bought it, so of course it was second hand. But also, there's the fact that it did seem to have some what are called microfractures. Now, we're not going to get too much into technical stuff, but basically, you can get little cracks and fractures which will happen if you're using tools like hammers, if you're using something like the leaf spring. Gradually, as all of this usage is happening while it's cold, even if you don't see it with your eye, either on the surface or deeper in the material, there are little cracks here and there, which of course get worse and worse until one day it's too much and then it breaks. And of course this means that I'm kind of dealing with, I'd say, almost an inferior material to start off with, rather than what's called virgin steel, which just means stuff that's straight out of the foundry. It's new steel, it's got no damage, no problems, no imperfections. It's just the steel that you've ordered, and there's anything else that happens to it is what you, the blacksmith, have done. So working with something second-hand, you've got all those problems to deal with. So I was being careful, and that's hence why I wanted to not have too much of a wasp waste effect and create a weak point. On top of that, I quite like the Celtic design. And then you've got the handle, which is full tang, which means rather than having sort of a rod coming from the bottom of the blade, and then you just get a sort of a piece of wood, and then it slots on there, kind of like a male and female. I'm sure people make dirty jokes out of this, but really though, it's just a socket and fitting type of thing. And then at the end, you'll have maybe a pommel or nothing at all, and then you just peen it, which means you hammer the end of that bit of the tang until it sort of flattens and spreads out like a mushroom shape, and then that not only spreads over so it can't fall off, but also kind of squeezes and closes together, and then it holds it together tightly. I've had some problems with that where it tries to come loose and it starts rattling, like on my last sword, that Sparta type of thing, and it was kind of rattling and jiggling, and it's not so bad that it'll break, but it kind of feels tacky, and it's not so good when you're cutting because it kind of takes some of the force out into rotating. That's bad. So I instead went for what I always swear by, a full tang. So that's just, you have from the steel of the sword blade, it then goes into the handle, and it's all kind of one piece, think like a kitchen knife, and it's all the shape of the handle, and then you just have it like a sandwich. You've got your block of wood or other material, your block of wood or whatever, and then the metal sandwiched in between, and then you've got the holes with little pins in there. I used copper because I love the stuff, it always behaves itself. Copper pins, pop them in there, job's a good one. It should be noted as well that I find that when I say copper behaves itself, when you're trying to peen it, when you're trying to squish it in, if you're hammering too much on those pins in the wood when you're making a sword or a knife or something else with a full tang like that, what can happen is, as you're hammering and trying to make it mushroom out, that same thing I mentioned earlier, but you're doing it with the pins, if you've got a harder material, you have to do more hammering, you have to be rougher with it, which is okay, the pins can take it, but the problem is the handle material maybe can't. So it depends. Obviously some materials are more forgiving than others, that's why some people love micarta, because that's made from lots of layers of stuff like cloth or canvas, and that stuff can just squish around and do all kinds of things, and you pretty much have to be intentionally trying to destroy it to cause any real damage. But with what I was using, I was trying to give it a natural, real look, so I went for something I bought online years ago, which was some Spalted Ash. Now, ash is a wood which is kind of, I'd call it the English equivalent of hickory. Just like hickory, it's a really good straight-grained, pale-coloured wood, and it's good for making things like tool handles, spear staves, arrows, bows, all kinds of things. So it can bend around, it springs, it flexes. It's not quite so likely to splinter, but yet it's also not so crumbly like some woods. It's juicy stuff, it's really nice. And spalting is kind of a tree disease that eventually kills off. I'm not an expert on, I forgot the name, but basically, the sorts of thing that tree surgeons do, that sort of art. But I know that when that disease happens, it kills the tree off, and they usually cut it down before it spreads or whatever. But when that disease is happening, before it's kind of rotted the whole thing inside out, you get these streaks, and it almost looks like a zebra pattern or a tiger stripes. So you've got this pale, almost white wood, which was the original ash. Mine's got yellow because I stained it with linseed oil, so it comes up with more golden colour. But the original is white. And then you've got these black streaks, and that is from the disease, the spalting. And it comes up really nice. And basically the lines are following the grain of the wood. So notice it kind of goes a bit diagonal. Now, if you're trying to learn bladesmithing, obviously if you're making something with a long handle, like a spear, or you're making something like an axe, when you're making the handle, you've got to make sure you've got the straight grain running along where your handle is. It's very important. But when you're making something like a sword, it's not very important. People even use burls and weird disease growths and funny things which are horrible for the tree, but when you cut it down and make materials out of it look very, very beautiful. So you can use any kind of twists or weird patterns in a wood as long as the wood itself is intact. And then you just, hence that's why I've got the diagonal streaks on there, because for whatever reason when the wood was cut, the grain of the wood was going diagonally along it, and that's fine. It comes up with a very nice streaked pattern along it. Like I said, it doesn't matter if you're making something like a short knife handle or something, then it doesn't actually matter. Even if you're not doing a full tang and you're doing that sort of stick, sort of rat tail tang I mentioned earlier, the same principle applies. Because it's not a long stave, you don't have to worry about it being straight-grained and worrying about it trying to flex and return to form without snapping or, splintering. It's not a problem. The only problems with stuff like splintering either happen while you're making the sword, as in from working on the material and hammering pins in and whatnot, or are problems that happen because someone's, cut at the sword and been parried and it's direct damage, the sort of thing that you wouldn't expect any type of wood to survive with any grain. So yeah, it's good stuff, and like I said, with that, the wood doesn't usually splinter much, but I decided to use copper pins, not only because they look beautiful, they either come up in a sort of pinkish colour, or they end up gradually fading to a sort of brown colour, which gives it a nice natural, almost bronzed look. But as much as I could use brass pins, which have a more bronze look, with that sort of yellowed coloration, the problem I have with brass pins is, yes, they're quite good, but they do require more hammering and more work to make them, squish in and do all of that holding the handle together. And the more you work it, the more likely it is to splinter the wood and crack it and break it. I didn't want to upset myself by ruining a perfectly great, bit of handle material. So I decided to go for the softer material, and it was easy and I could more gently work it and get it the way I wanted to. And then I just did all of the shaping with a belt sander. So I was just using rough grip belts, getting rough idea. And I love using full tang hilts because when I'm doing that, I can, sort of hold the blade in the hand, and you get a rough idea for how it will feel when you're swinging it or, thrusting of it, parrying, all of those things. We don't have to, you get a better idea before you've put the handle on and quenched it, tempered it, and all those things. So I've always loved that about full tang swords, and also you can do the same process while you're putting the handle on. You can't swing too much, of course, because if you make an impact, then it could potentially, the handle's not fully attached and it could try to rattle and come loose and break, but you can still get a little bit of a waft in the air and get a feel for the handling of the blade and get an idea of whether you want it thinner, narrower, whether you want it more rounded or more oval shape, maybe blocky. You know, you've got various types of designs, and it's up to the user and the blacksmith how they feel they want the sword to behave. But having a feel for how it behaves before you've fully committed is nice. You can take it one step at a time and then think, I don't quite like this, so I'm going to make these alterations, do a little bit at a time. I like this feeling, we'll keep it like that, and then just work on it gradually, and that's how I did it. That's why actually I was going to have a thicker sort of pommel shape, like on some of the historical Celtic swords, but I found as I was handling it, I wasn't quite liking the way it was brushing against the palm of my hand right at the heel, and I thought, if I've committed to the design I first thought of, it's going to really hurt and it's going to be uncomfortable and cause blisters using it. And of course I don't want that for myself or somebody else using it, so I instead decided to have it a bit closer to the thickness of the rest of the handle, but still a bit thicker and more bulbous to stop it from trying to slip out of the hand and give it a more secure grip, but to not quite as extreme a degree. So that was nice to feel and get an idea for that handling and think, okay, I'm satisfied with this now, and then commit. There are still some things that I went a bit overzealous because I'm not used the low 24 grit belts that I've had before. Lowest I ever had before was 40 grit, which works a bit more slowly, but they wear out faster. So I accidentally wore a bit too much material away in one part and I was a bit unhappy, but I just kind of fixed it up as best I could, and I'm moderately satisfied with the result. And I haven't done any test cutting yet, but I hope that someday, well, soon, probably in the summer or in the spring when it starts to brighten up more and it's nice light outdoors, I will do some test cutting, and that should be nice to see as well. So that'll be my Celtic sword, giving it some proper swings and chops and doing all of that fancy stuff. And I hope you'll be there to watch it and will enjoy it. Thanks for the watching, and see you later. Goodbye.